Remember Edward Snowden's revelations about Section 702 bulk data collection? Back then, people thought mass surveillance conspiracies were paranoid fantasies. The Jewel v. NSA lawsuit seemed like a long shot against an impossible enemy. But here we are in 2025, and those conspiracy theorists who got laughed at for claiming the government was spying on everyone turned out to be right. Hello, folks. Welcome back to another episode of Brain Blaze. Today, we're covering modern conspiracy theories that turned out to be completely true, and I'm going to be honest, some of these recent revelations will make you question everything you thought you knew about privacy and corporate honesty. The smart device stuff alone is going to blow your mind. Smart devices are always listening. Let's talk about surveillance programs that actually got exposed. The NSA's Section 702 bulk data collection program, revealed through Edward Snowden's leaked documents, showed us exactly how government agencies were monitoring private communications on a massive scale. This wasn't some theoretical possibility that privacy advocates were worried about. This was documented reality with internal memos and operational procedures. The ACLU's research into programs like PRISM and Upstream revealed the scope of warrantless surveillance that was happening under Section 702 authority. These weren't targeted investigations of specific suspects. These were bulk collection programs that swept up communications from ordinary Americans. The 2021 statistics showed 232,432 targets under these surveillance programs, and that number kept expanding as the NSA broadened their interpretation of what constituted legitimate intelligence gathering. PRISM gave intelligence agencies direct access to user data from major tech companies including Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. The program allowed the NSA to collect emails, photos, videos, documents, and connection logs directly from company servers. Upstream collection was even more invasive, intercepting communications as they traveled across internet backbone infrastructure, scanning content for specific selectors and keywords. The conspiracy theorists who spent years warning about government mass surveillance programs were dismissed as paranoid extremists who didn't understand how intelligence agencies actually operated. Privacy advocates were told they were overreacting to theoretical possibilities that would never be implemented on American citizens. The technical experts who suggested that bulk data collection was both possible and profitable were labeled as alarmists who watched too many spy movies. Then the Snowden documents came out and proved that not only were these programs real, they were more extensive than most critics had imagined. The NSA wasn't just collecting metadata about phone calls and internet traffic, they were storing actual content from communications. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was rubber-stamping requests for expanded surveillance authority with minimal oversight or accountability. The documentation showed that intelligence agencies were using Section 702 authority to conduct what they called backdoor searches on American citizens. These searches allowed agents to query databases of collected communications using American identifiers without obtaining warrants. The ACLU found that these backdoor searches were being conducted hundreds of thousands of times per year, turning foreign intelligence authorities into domestic surveillance tools. What made this conspiracy theory particularly vindicated was how the government's own oversight reports confirmed the scope of the surveillance. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board found significant compliance problems with Section 702 programs. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court issued rare public rebukes of NSA collection practices that exceeded legal authorities. Even government watchdogs were admitting that the surveillance had gone beyond what Congress intended to authorize. The policy responses that followed these revelations basically confirmed everything that privacy advocates had been predicting. The USA Freedom Act attempted to limit bulk collection programs, but critics argued the reforms were mostly cosmetic. The ACLU continued pushing for warrant requirements for backdoor searches of American communications, highlighting how surveillance authorities were being used for domestic law enforcement rather than foreign intelligence. Intelligence agencies fought against these reform efforts, arguing that warrant requirements would cripple their ability to protect national security. But their own documents showed that the bulk collection programs had produced minimal actionable intelligence that couldn't have been obtained through targeted surveillance with proper legal oversight. The conspiracy theorists had been right about both the existence of mass surveillance and its questionable effectiveness. The broader pattern here shows how surveillance capabilities that sound impossible to most people are not only technically feasible, they become standard operating procedures once the legal and technical infrastructure exists. Ring doorbell partnerships with law enforcement, location tracking through mobile apps, social media monitoring of political activists, all of these programs followed similar patterns of expansion beyond their original stated purposes. Former NSA officials who became whistleblowers after Snowden provided additional confirmation of how these programs operated in practice. They described a culture where expanding surveillance capabilities was seen as a technical challenge rather than a civil liberties concern. The attitude was that if the technology existed to collect more data, and if legal interpretations could be stretched to justify that collection, then the programs would expand to fill those capabilities. The conspiracy theorists weren't just right about the basic premise that government agencies were conducting mass surveillance on American citizens. They were actually underestimating how normalized these practices had become within intelligence agencies. The programs weren't secret experiments or rogue operations. They were routine intelligence gathering with institutional support and legal cover. Privacy advocates who had spent years warning about the potential for surveillance overreach found themselves vindicated in the most depressing way possible. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU had been filing lawsuits and lobbying for oversight reforms since the early 2000s, only to be told they were fighting against imaginary threats. The really disturbing part was discovering how these surveillance programs connected to broader patterns of government overreach that most people assumed were impossible in democratic societies. The infrastructure for mass surveillance wasn't just being built for foreign intelligence, it was being used for domestic law enforcement, political monitoring, and social control in ways that the original legal authorities never contemplated. So, when someone tells you that worrying about government surveillance is paranoid conspiracy thinking, you can point them to the documented evidence of programs that exceeded their legal authorities for over a decade before being exposed. The conspiracy theorists understood institutional incentives better than the experts who dismissed their concerns. But government surveillance was just the beginning of how companies learned to manipulate behavior on an industrial scale. Social media, psychological manipulation programs. The ACLU's research into Section 230 and algorithmic amplification shows how social media platforms became vehicles for spreading conspiracy theories and disinformation at unprecedented scale. While privacy advocates were fighting government surveillance programs, tech companies were building their own systems for monitoring and influencing user behavior through algorithmic content curation. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act gave platforms broad immunity from liability for user-generated content. But it also created an environment where algorithmic amplification could operate without meaningful oversight. The Pew Research Center found that social media algorithms consistently promoted sensational and emotionally charged content because it generated higher engagement rates, which translated directly into advertising revenue. The conspiracy theories about algorithmic manipulation weren't entirely wrong, they just focused on the wrong mechanisms. Instead of deliberate psychological experiments, the platforms were using engagement optimization algorithms that had similar effects on user behavior. Content that provoked strong emotional responses, whether anger, fear, or outrage, received algorithmic boosts that increased its reach and visibility. These algorithmic systems created what researchers called filter bubbles and echo chambers, where users were primarily exposed to content that reinforced their existing beliefs and biases. The algorithms learned that controversial and polarizing content kept users engaged longer, so they systematically promoted conspiracy theories, political extremism, and divisive social issues over factual information and balanced perspectives. The ACLU documented how these algorithmic amplification systems disproportionately affected marginalized communities and vulnerable populations. Conspiracy theories about vaccines, election fraud, and government surveillance spread faster and reached larger audiences than authoritative sources debunking those theories. The platform's business models incentivized the spread of misinformation because controversial content generated more user engagement. Pew Research found that users who spent more time on social media platforms showed increased belief in conspiracy theories and decreased trust in traditional news sources and government institutions. The algorithmic curation systems weren't just reflecting user preferences, they were actively shaping those preferences by controlling what information users encountered and how frequently they encountered it. The platforms defended their algorithmic systems by claiming they were simply giving users content they wanted to see, but internal research showed the companies understood how their algorithms influenced user beliefs and behaviors. They knew that promoting emotionally charged content increased engagement metrics, and they prioritized those metrics over concerns about misinformation or social harm. Former employees who became whistleblowers revealed that content moderation policies were inconsistently applied and often overruled by engagement optimization algorithms. Posts that violated community guidelines but generated high engagement were allowed to remain visible, while factual content that didn't generate strong emotional responses was algorithmically suppressed. The conspiracy theory communities that formed on these platforms weren't just organic grassroots movements, they were partially products of algorithmic systems designed to maximize user engagement. The algorithms identified users who showed interest in conspiracy content and then fed them increasingly extreme theories to keep them scrolling and clicking. Legal challenges to Section 230 protections have focused on whether platforms should be held liable for algorithmic amplification of harmful content. Critics argue that when platforms use algorithms to promote specific content, they're acting as publishers rather than neutral intermediaries and should lose their immunity protections. The regulatory response has been complicated by the technical complexity of algorithmic systems and the global nature of social media platforms. The European Union's Digital Services Act requires platforms to provide more transparency about their algorithmic systems, but enforcement remains challenging because the algorithms are constantly evolving and their effects are difficult to measure. The broader pattern shows how technological systems designed for one purpose can have unintended consequences that reshape society in fundamental ways. The social media platforms weren't necessarily trying to undermine democratic institutions or promote conspiracy theories, but their business models created incentives that had those effects. What makes this particularly relevant to conspiracy theories is how the platforms became both the subject of conspiracy theories and the primary mechanism for spreading them. Users who believed in government surveillance conspiracies were using platforms that were actually conducting their own forms of behavioral monitoring and influence operations through algorithmic curation. The irony is that many of the conspiracy theories about social media manipulation contained elements of truth, but they focused on the wrong mechanisms and motivations. The platforms weren't running secret government psychological operations, but they were using algorithmic systems that had similar effects on user behavior and belief formation. The documentation that emerged through whistleblower revelations and regulatory investigations showed that platform executives understood the social and political implications of their algorithmic systems, but prioritized business metrics over public welfare. This wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense, but it was a systematic pattern of corporate decision-making that prioritized profit over social responsibility. The conspiracy theories about tech company manipulation weren't entirely accurate in their details, but they correctly identified that these platforms were influencing user behavior in ways that weren't transparent or accountable to the public. The algorithmic amplification systems created many of the same effects that deliberate manipulation programs would have produced. But social media algorithmic manipulation was just one example of how corporate interests were operating behind the scenes in ways that most people assumed were impossible. The next revelations would show that some companies were literally trying to control the weather. Corporate weather modification cover-ups. The documented history of government psychological operations shows us that corporate manipulation programs weren't the only conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. The CIA's Project MKUltra, which ran from 1953 to 1973, conducted illegal human experiments involving mind control, torture, and psychological manipulation on unwitting subjects. For decades, anyone who suggested the government was running secret programs to control human behavior got dismissed as paranoid conspiracy theorists. MKUltra involved over 150 separate research projects conducted at universities, hospitals, and research institutions across the United States and Canada. The program used techniques including electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and physical abuse, and administration of drugs like LSD without informed consent. Subjects included mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and ordinary citizens who had no idea they were being used as test subjects in government experiments. The conspiracy theorists who claimed the government was conducting mind control experiments were absolutely right, but they actually underestimated the scope and brutality of what was happening. MKUltra wasn't just theoretical research into psychological manipulation, it was systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. The program violated every ethical standard for human experimentation and caused permanent psychological damage to thousands of victims. Project Mockingbird was another CIA operation that conspiracy theorists correctly identified before it became public knowledge. The program involved recruiting journalists and media executives to spread propaganda and disinformation through mainstream news outlets. The CIA was literally controlling news coverage to shape public opinion on foreign policy issues, domestic politics, and intelligence operations. Mockingbird gave the CIA influence over major newspapers, magazines, television networks, and publishing houses. Journalists were paid to write articles promoting CIA interests, while editors killed stories that might damage intelligence operations. The program allowed the agency to plant false stories, suppress unfavorable coverage, and manipulate public discourse on a massive scale. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government control of media were ridiculed by the same journalists who were secretly working for intelligence agencies. Critics who suggested that news coverage was being manipulated by government operatives were dismissed as paranoid extremists who didn't understand how journalism actually worked. The irony was that some of the journalists dismissing these theories were literally on CIA payrolls. Both MKUltra and Mockingbird operated for decades without meaningful oversight or accountability. Congressional investigations in the 1970s revealed the existence of these programs, but most of the documentation had been destroyed to prevent exposure of illegal activities. The Church Committee hearings showed that intelligence agencies had been conducting domestic operations that violated their legal authorities and constitutional restrictions. The pattern here shows how institutional secrecy allows illegal programs to operate without detection or accountability. Intelligence agencies created compartmentalized operations where only a few people knew the full scope of what was happening. They used legitimate research institutions and media organizations as cover for illegal activities. They destroyed evidence and intimidated witnesses to prevent exposure of criminal behavior. Former CIA officials who became whistleblowers after these programs were exposed described a culture where illegal activities were normalized and justified as necessary for national security. The attitude was that constitutional restrictions and legal oversight were obstacles to effective intelligence operations rather than essential safeguards for democratic governance. The conspiracy theorists weren't just right about the existence of these programs, they correctly understood that government agencies would use their secrecy authorities to conduct illegal domestic operations. They predicted that intelligence agencies would target American citizens, manipulate media coverage, and destroy evidence of their crimes. The documented evidence proved that these predictions were accurate. What makes these historical cases particularly relevant is how they established patterns that continued into the digital age. The same institutional incentives that drove MKUltra and Mockingbird created the surveillance programs that Snowden exposed decades later. The techniques for manipulating public opinion that were developed during Mockingbird evolved into the social media influence operations that we see today. The regulatory reforms that followed the Church Committee investigations were supposed to prevent future abuses, but they primarily focused on creating oversight mechanisms rather than eliminating the underlying authorities that enabled these programs. Intelligence agencies learned to operate within legal frameworks while still conducting activities that violated the spirit of constitutional protections. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government mind control and media manipulation understood something that mainstream experts missed. Institutional power will expand to fill available space unless it faces meaningful resistance. They correctly predicted that intelligence agencies would use their authorities for domestic political purposes rather than limiting themselves to foreign intelligence gathering. The documentation that survived government efforts to destroy evidence showed that these programs weren't aberrations or rogue operations. They were systematic institutional practices with high-level approval and coordination. The conspiracy theorists were right about both the existence of these programs and their integration into normal intelligence operations. But government psychological operations and media manipulation were just the beginning of how powerful institutions learn to hide their activities from public scrutiny. The next revelations would show that some of the most trusted institutions in society were systematically deceiving the public about matters of life and death. Pharmaceutical data manipulation schemes. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment stands as one of the most horrific examples of medical conspiracy theories that turned out to be completely true. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted a study on untreated syphilis in rural black men in Alabama, telling participants they were receiving free health care for bad blood. The conspiracy theorists who claimed the government was conducting illegal medical experiments on black Americans were dismissed as paranoid racists who didn't understand how medical research actually worked. The study recruited 399 black men with syphilis and 201 without the disease as a control group. The men were never told they had syphilis, never gave informed consent for the research, and were deliberately denied treatment even after penicillin was discovered as an effective cure in the 1940s. Researchers wanted to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis, so they actively prevented participants from receiving medical care that could have saved their lives. The Public Health Service worked with local medical providers to ensure the men didn't receive treatment elsewhere. They provided incentives like free meals, transportation, and burial insurance to keep participants in the study, while lying about the purpose of the research. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term that covered various ailments, when they were actually being studied as they suffered and died from a treatable disease. The conspiracy extended beyond the original researchers to include the Centers for Disease Control, which continued the study after taking over from the Public Health Service in the 1960s. Medical professionals, public health officials, and government administrators all knew about the deception, but allowed it to continue for 4 decades. The study only ended in 1972 when a whistleblower leaked information to the press, forcing public exposure of the experiment. By the time the study ended, 128 participants had died from syphilis or related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The men who survived suffered from blindness, deafness, mental illness, and other complications that could have been prevented with proper treatment. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government medical experiments on vulnerable populations had been absolutely right about the scope and brutality of what was happening. The asbestos industry provides another example of corporate conspiracy theories that prove to be accurate. For decades, companies like Johns Manville, Asbestos Manhattan, and other asbestos manufacturers knew their products cause cancer and other deadly diseases, but deliberately hid this information from workers and the public. Internal company documents revealed a coordinated effort to suppress medical research, discredit scientists, and mislead regulatory agencies about the health risks of asbestos exposure. Company executives received medical reports as early as the 1930s showing that asbestos workers were developing lung diseases at alarming rates. Instead of warning workers or improving safety conditions, the companies hired their own doctors to conduct studies that would downplay the health risks. They funded research designed to create doubt about the link between asbestos and disease, while suppressing studies that showed clear evidence of harm. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of deception and cover-up. Companies removed warning labels from asbestos products, fought against workplace safety regulations, and lobbied government agencies to avoid restrictions on asbestos use. They hired public relations firms to spread disinformation about asbestos safety and funded front groups that appeared to be independent scientific organizations, but were actually industry propaganda operations. Workers who developed asbestos-related diseases were told their illnesses were caused by other factors like smoking or genetic predisposition. Company doctors would diagnose workers with less serious conditions to avoid acknowledging asbestos-related diseases that might trigger workers' compensation claims or regulatory scrutiny. The companies maintained this deception for decades while thousands of workers died from preventable diseases. The conspiracy theorists who claimed that corporations were deliberately poisoning workers for profit were ridiculed by industry experts and government officials who insisted that American companies would never knowingly harm their employees. Medical professionals who questioned asbestos safety were attacked as alarmists who didn't understand industrial hygiene. Worker advocates who demanded better safety protections were dismissed as anti-business extremists. The truth only emerged through litigation in the 1970s and 1980s when internal company documents were forced into public view through court proceedings. The documents revealed decades of deliberate deception, showing that company executives knew about asbestos dangers but chose to prioritize profits over worker safety. The conspiracy theorists had been right about both the scope of corporate knowledge and the deliberate nature of the cover-up. Both the Tuskegee experiment and the asbestos cover-up show how institutional power can operate in secret for decades while systematically harming vulnerable populations. The conspiracy theorists who warned about these programs understood something that mainstream experts missed. Institutions with power and secrecy will use that combination to serve their own interests rather than protecting the people they claim to serve. The pattern of denial, cover-up, and eventual exposure that characterized these historical cases would repeat itself in the digital age, where new technologies created new opportunities for surveillance and control. The same institutional incentives that drove medical experiments and corporate cover-ups would find expression in financial monitoring systems that government financial surveillance were impossible in democratic societies. The House Judiciary Committee's 2024 report exposed exactly what privacy advocates had been warning about for years: systematic financial surveillance operating far beyond legal boundaries. Federal agencies weren't just monitoring suspicious transactions, they were collecting private financial data on millions of Americans through back-channel communications with major banks and financial institutions. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the FBI had established direct data-sharing relationships with Bank of America, PayPal, Charles Schwab, HSBC, U.S. Bank, and Barclays. These weren't formal legal requests with judicial oversight. These were ongoing surveillance partnerships that allowed government agencies to monitor customer transactions in real time without warrants or probable cause. The surveillance programs used keyword filtering systems that targeted political terms like MAGA and Trump in transaction descriptions. Americans were being flagged for investigation based on purchases from stores like Cabela's, Bass Pro Shop, and Dick's Sporting Goods because government analysts decided these retailers attracted customers with Second Amendment interests. The surveillance wasn't targeting criminal activity, it was profiling Americans based on their political beliefs and constitutional rights. The Domestic Security Alliance Council, a public-private partnership run by the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, operated a web portal that shared intelligence products with financial institutions. The portal helped banks identify individuals who fit profiles of domestic violent extremists based on constitutionally protected activities like political beliefs, religious views, and lawful firearm purchases. Conservative political viewpoints were essentially being criminalized through financial surveillance. The NSA Section 702 surveillance program, originally designed for foreign intelligence, expanded into domestic financial monitoring through programs called PRISM and Upstream. PRISM allowed the NSA to obtain communications directly from tech companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, and Microsoft, while Upstream intercepted financial communications as they flowed through internet infrastructure. The FBI routinely searched these databases to examine Americans' private financial communications for domestic investigations unrelated to national security. The scale of Section 702 surveillance grew dramatically over time, with the government targeting communications of 232,432 individuals, groups, and organizations in 2021. Given the expansion rate, government agencies were probably collecting over 1 billion communications annually under surveillance authorities never intended for domestic financial monitoring. The ACLU documented how virtually every email entering or leaving the United States was being scanned for suspicious keywords. FBI agents conducted millions of backdoor searches of surveillance databases to examine private communications and transaction records without warrants. These searches were being used for criminal investigations completely unrelated to terrorism or foreign intelligence, turning surveillance programs into general law enforcement tools. The searches violated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. In March 2025, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court authorized new certifications for counter-narcotics operations, allowing the FBI to categorize drug-related financial transactions as foreign intelligence. This expansion broadened surveillance of Americans who had no connection to international drug trafficking, showing how surveillance authorities consistently expanded beyond their original purposes. The constitutional violations from these programs were massive and ongoing. Government agencies were conducting warrantless searches of millions of Americans' financial records based solely on algorithmic profiling. The programs violated due process rights by flagging citizens for investigation without probable cause or evidence of criminal activity. The Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches became meaningless when applied to digital financial transactions. Financial privacy advocates who warned about expanding government surveillance were systematically dismissed as paranoid conspiracy theorists. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the American Civil Liberties Union spent years filing lawsuits and publishing reports about financial surveillance overreach, only to be labeled as anti-government extremists undermining national security efforts. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, operating in complete secrecy, expanded surveillance scope through classified rulings that the public never saw. The court's responsibilities changed dramatically from overseeing targeted surveillance to authorizing sweeping programs that assessed constitutionality without public participation or review. The ACLU fought for years to bring transparency to this secretive court system. Legal challenges to these surveillance programs proceeded through federal courts, with the ACLU filing class action lawsuits representing millions of Americans whose financial privacy was violated. The cases challenged the authority of government agencies to conduct bulk financial surveillance without judicial oversight, arguing that the programs exceeded legal authorities and violated constitutional protections. Government agencies desperately tried to retroactively legalize these surveillance programs through emergency legislation and classified legal interpretations. The FBI and Treasury Department lobbied Congress to authorize the financial surveillance they'd already been conducting for years, essentially asking for permission to continue violating constitutional rights they'd been violating all along. The conspiracy about comprehensive financial surveillance wasn't some dystopian future scenario that privacy advocates were warning about. It was documented reality operating with the cooperation of major financial institutions. Every digital transaction Americans made was being monitored, analyzed, and stored by government agencies operating outside legal frameworks designed to protect financial privacy and constitutional rights. The pattern of surveillance expansion, legal justification, and public denial that characterized financial monitoring programs would prove to be just one example of how powerful institutions coordinated their activities behind the scenes. The same techniques for managing public perception and controlling information flow that enabled financial surveillance would soon be exposed in other sectors where institutional coordination was supposed to be impossible. Corporate media coordination scandals. The CIA's Operation Mockingbird shows us that media manipulation conspiracies weren't just theoretical possibilities that paranoid people worried about. They were systematic institutional practices with documented evidence and congressional investigations. From the 1950s through the 1970s, the CIA recruited journalists and media executives to spread propaganda and disinformation through mainstream news outlets, giving intelligence agencies direct control over news coverage and public discourse. Mockingbird involved paying journalists at major newspapers, magazines, and television networks to write articles promoting CIA interests while suppressing stories that might damage intelligence operations. The program gave the agency influence over news coverage at the Washington Post, New York Times, CBS, Time magazine, and dozens of other major media outlets. Journalists were literally on CIA payrolls while presenting themselves as independent reporters serving the public interest. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government control of media were ridiculed by the same journalists who were secretly working for intelligence agencies. Critics who suggested that news coverage was being manipulated by government operatives were dismissed as paranoid extremists who didn't understand how journalism actually worked. The irony was that some of the journalists dismissing these theories were literally receiving CIA paychecks for their propaganda work. CIA operatives worked directly with editors and publishers to plant false stories, kill unfavorable coverage, and shape public opinion on foreign policy issues. The agency could essentially dictate news coverage of international events, domestic politics, and intelligence operations through their network of recruited media assets. Stories that might expose CIA activities or challenge official government narratives were systematically suppressed across multiple news outlets. The program allowed intelligence agencies to manipulate public discourse without the public knowing they were consuming government propaganda disguised as independent journalism. Americans thought they were reading objective news coverage when they were actually being fed carefully crafted intelligence operation talking points designed to support CIA objectives and foreign policy goals. Mockingbird recruitment targeted influential journalists and media executives who could shape coverage across entire news organizations. The CIA didn't just want individual reporters. They wanted people who could influence editorial decisions, story assignments, and coverage priorities at major news outlets. The goal was systematic control over information flow rather than just occasional planted stories. The Church Committee investigations in the 1970s exposed Operation Mockingbird along with other illegal CIA domestic operations, but most of the documentation had been destroyed to prevent full exposure of the program's scope. Congressional investigators found evidence of CIA relationships with journalists at over 50 American news organizations, but the actual number was probably much higher because records had been systematically destroyed. Former CIA officials who testified before Congress described Mockingbird as a routine intelligence operation rather than an aberration or rogue program. The agency considered media manipulation to be a standard tool for advancing American interests overseas and controlling domestic political discourse. Intelligence operatives saw nothing wrong with using American journalists as propaganda assets because they believed the ends justified the means. The program continued operating even after congressional exposure, because the legal reforms that followed the Church Committee investigations focused on oversight rather than eliminating the underlying authorities that enabled media manipulation. Intelligence agencies learned to operate within reformed legal frameworks while still conducting activities that violated the spirit of press freedom and democratic governance. Journalists who participated in Mockingbird defended their cooperation with intelligence agencies by claiming they were serving national security interests and fighting communist propaganda. They argued that working with the CIA was patriotic duty rather than journalistic corruption, showing how intelligence agencies successfully convinced media professionals to abandon their ethical obligations to the public. The conspiracy theorists who warned about CIA media control understood something that mainstream journalists missed. Intelligence agencies would use their secrecy authorities and financial resources to manipulate public opinion through supposedly independent news outlets. They correctly predicted that government propaganda operations would target American citizens rather than limiting themselves to foreign audiences. Independent journalists who exposed CIA media relationships faced professional retaliation and personal attacks designed to destroy their credibility. Intelligence agencies used their media assets to discredit reporters who were investigating government propaganda operations, creating a system where journalists who exposed media manipulation were attacked by the same outlets that were being manipulated. The techniques developed during Operation Mockingbird evolved into more sophisticated influence operations that continued into the digital age. The same institutional incentives that drove Cold War propaganda programs created the information warfare capabilities that intelligence agencies use today through social media platforms and online news outlets. What made Mockingbird particularly effective was how it operated through legitimate news organizations rather than obvious propaganda outlets. Americans trusted major newspapers and television networks to provide objective information, so they were vulnerable to manipulation when those outlets were secretly serving intelligence agency interests rather than public information needs. The pattern of recruitment, manipulation, and cover-up that characterized Mockingbird established precedents for how powerful institutions could control information flow while maintaining plausible deniability about their influence operations. The program showed that systematic deception could operate for decades within trusted institutions without public detection or accountability. The conspiracy theorists weren't just right about the existence of government media manipulation. They correctly understood that intelligence agencies would prioritize propaganda effectiveness over democratic values like press freedom and informed public discourse. The documented evidence proved that their warnings about institutional manipulation were accurate predictions rather than paranoid speculation. But government control of media was just one example of how powerful institutions learned to manipulate information systems that the public assumed were independent and trustworthy. The same techniques for hiding institutional coordination and suppressing inconvenient information would soon be exposed in other sectors where public trust was essential for institutional legitimacy. Environmental data suppression operations. The asbestos industry conspiracy shows us how corporations learned to hide deadly health information from workers and the public for decades while people died from preventable diseases. Internal company documents revealed that executives at Johns Manville, Asbestos Manhattan, and other major asbestos manufacturers knew their products caused cancer and lung disease as early as the 1930s, but they deliberately suppressed this information to protect their profits. Company executives received medical reports showing that asbestos workers were developing lung diseases at alarming rates, but instead of warning workers or improving safety conditions, they hired their own doctors to conduct studies that would downplay the health risks. They funded research designed to create doubt about the link between asbestos and disease, while suppressing studies that showed clear evidence of harm. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of deception and cover-up that operated for over 4 decades. Companies removed warning labels from asbestos products, fought against workplace safety regulations, and lobbied government agencies to avoid restrictions on asbestos use. They hired public relations firms to spread disinformation about asbestos safety and funded front groups that appeared to be independent scientific organizations, but were actually industry propaganda operations. Workers who developed asbestos-related diseases were told their illnesses were caused by other factors like smoking or genetic predisposition. Company doctors would diagnose workers with less serious conditions to avoid acknowledging asbestos-related diseases that might trigger workers' compensation claims or regulatory scrutiny. The companies maintained this deception while thousands of workers died from mesothelioma, lung cancer, and other asbestos-related diseases. Internal memos between company executives revealed the calculated nature of their deception. A 1966 memo from Bendix Corporation stated that asbestos health hazards were well documented, but recommended against warning workers because it might stir up a hornet's nest. Another memo from Johns Manville executives discussed how to buy time by funding studies that would delay regulatory action while continuing to sell deadly products. The conspiracy theorists who claimed that corporations were deliberately poisoning workers for profit were ridiculed by industry experts and government officials who insisted that American companies would never knowingly harm their employees. Medical professionals who questioned asbestos safety were attacked as alarmists who didn't understand industrial hygiene. Worker advocates who demanded better safety protections were dismissed as anti-business extremists. Company lawyers developed sophisticated legal strategies to delay and minimize liability for asbestos-related diseases. They would challenge medical evidence linking asbestos to specific illnesses, argue that other factors caused workers' diseases, and use procedural tactics to drag out litigation for years. The goal was to exhaust victims' resources and force them to accept minimal settlements rather than pursuing full compensation. The asbestos companies coordinated their deception through industry trade associations and shared research that helped them maintain consistent messaging about product safety. The Asbestos Information Association, funded by major manufacturers, published materials claiming that asbestos was safe when properly handled, despite internal company documents showing that no level of exposure was safe. Insurance companies that provided coverage for asbestos manufacturers were also part of the conspiracy, helping companies hide the true scope of health risks from regulators and the public. Insurance executives knew about asbestos dangers from their own actuarial studies, but continued providing coverage while helping companies develop strategies to minimize liability exposure. The truth only emerged through litigation in the 1970s and 1980s, when internal company documents were forced into public view through court proceedings. The documents revealed decades of deliberate deception, showing that company executives knew about asbestos dangers but chose to prioritize profits over worker safety. The conspiracy theorists had been right about both the scope of corporate knowledge and the deliberate nature of the cover-up. By the time the cover-up was exposed, over 27 million Americans had been exposed to asbestos in their workplaces, and hundreds of thousands would eventually die from asbestos-related diseases. The companies that knew about these dangers for decades continued selling their products and exposing new workers to deadly hazards while maintaining public positions that asbestos was safe. The regulatory response to asbestos exposure came decades too late because government agencies relied on industry-funded research rather than conducting independent safety assessments. The Environmental Protection Agency didn't begin regulating asbestos until 1970s, 40 years after companies knew their products were killing workers. Even then, the regulations were limited and allowed continued use of asbestos in many applications. The asbestos conspiracy established patterns of corporate deception that would be repeated in other industries facing health and safety challenges. The same techniques for suppressing research, manipulating public opinion, and avoiding regulatory oversight would be used by tobacco companies, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and chemical producers when their products were linked to serious health problems. Former company executives who became whistleblowers after retirement revealed how normalized the deception had become within corporate culture. They described meetings where executives discussed worker health risks as public relations problems rather than moral obligations. The attitude was that protecting company profits justified any level of deception about product dangers. The conspiracy theorists who warned about corporate cover-ups of environmental and health hazards understood something that mainstream experts missed. Companies with the resources and motivation to hide dangerous information would use those capabilities to protect their financial interests rather than public health. The documented evidence proved that institutional power would prioritize profits over human lives when secrecy allowed them to avoid accountability. The same institutional incentives that drove the asbestos cover-up would find new expression in the digital age, where financial institutions discovered that sophisticated technology could hide market manipulation just as effectively as corporate secrecy had hidden health hazards. Digital currency manipulation systems. The NSA's financial surveillance programs under Executive Order 12333 show us how intelligence agencies learned to monitor private financial communications without the legal restrictions that applied to domestic surveillance programs. While Section 702 required some judicial oversight for communication surveillance, Executive Order 12333 allowed the NSA to collect financial data on Americans through foreign intelligence operations that operated outside normal constitutional protections. Executive Order 12333, signed by President Reagan in 1981, gave intelligence agencies broad authorities to collect information on Americans if that collection occurred outside the United States or involved foreign intelligence targets. The NSA used these authorities to monitor international financial transactions, banking communications, and money transfers that involved American citizens, essentially creating a parallel financial surveillance system that avoided domestic privacy protections. The intelligence agencies partnered with foreign governments and international banking networks to access financial data that they couldn't legally collect through domestic surveillance programs. The NSA worked with allies in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance to share financial intelligence that each country's domestic laws would have prohibited them from collecting on their own citizens. This arrangement allowed American intelligence agencies to access detailed financial records on millions of Americans through foreign collection programs. Operation Mockingbird's techniques for manipulating information flow found new applications in financial surveillance programs that operated through similar coordination between government agencies and private institutions. Just as the CIA had recruited journalists to spread propaganda, intelligence agencies developed relationships with financial institutions that provided access to customer data without formal legal processes or judicial oversight. The NSA's financial surveillance capabilities expanded dramatically after the September 11th attacks, when counterterrorism authorities were used to justify monitoring financial communications that had previously been protected by banking privacy laws. The agency used terrorism investigations as justification for collecting bulk financial data on Americans who had no connection to terrorist activities, showing how national security authorities consistently expanded beyond their original purposes. Financial institutions cooperated with NSA surveillance programs through voluntary information sharing agreements that operated outside normal legal frameworks for government access to private records. Banks provided customer transaction data, account information, and financial communications to intelligence agencies without requiring warrants or court orders, essentially privatizing financial surveillance in ways that avoided constitutional restrictions on government data collection. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, known as SWIFT, became a key target for NSA financial surveillance because it processed international banking transactions for thousands of financial institutions worldwide. The agency monitored SWIFT communications to track money movements, identify financial networks, and build profiles of individuals and organizations based on their financial activities. Intelligence agencies used financial surveillance data for investigations that went far beyond terrorism and foreign intelligence, including domestic criminal cases, tax enforcement, and political monitoring. The NSA shared financial intelligence with other government agencies through programs that allowed law enforcement to access surveillance data without revealing its origins, creating parallel construction techniques that hid unconstitutional surveillance from courts and defense attorneys. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government financial surveillance understood that banking privacy laws would be ineffective against intelligence agencies with foreign collection authorities and international partnerships. They correctly predicted that national security justifications would be used to circumvent domestic privacy protections, and that financial institutions would cooperate with surveillance programs rather than protecting customer privacy. Privacy advocates who challenged financial surveillance programs faced the same institutional resistance that had characterized challenges to other intelligence operations. The Electronic Frontier Foundation and American Civil Liberties Union filed lawsuits arguing that financial surveillance violated Fourth Amendment protections, But government agencies claimed that foreign intelligence authorities exempted their programs from constitutional restrictions. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court issued classified rulings that expanded NSA authorities to collect financial data on Americans, but these decisions remained secret and couldn't be challenged through normal legal processes. The court's interpretations of Executive Order 12333 and other intelligence authorities allowed surveillance programs that exceeded what most legal experts believed was constitutionally permissible. Congressional oversight of financial surveillance programs was limited by classification restrictions and compartmentalized briefings that prevented most lawmakers from understanding the scope of intelligence collection. The few members of Congress who received detailed briefings about NSA financial surveillance were prohibited from discussing these programs publicly or sharing information with colleagues who weren't cleared for the same intelligence. Whistleblowers who exposed financial surveillance programs faced severe legal retaliation and professional destruction, just as intelligence agencies had retaliated against journalists who exposed Operation Mockingbird decades earlier. The same institutional patterns of secrecy, denial, and retaliation that had characterized Cold War intelligence operations continued into the digital age with financial surveillance programs. The technical capabilities that enabled NSA financial surveillance were far more sophisticated than most privacy advocates realized, involving real-time monitoring of international banking networks, automated analysis of financial transactions, and integration with other surveillance databases that created comprehensive profiles of American citizens' financial activities. International coordination between intelligence agencies allowed financial surveillance that exceeded what any single country could legally conduct on its own citizens. The NSA shared financial intelligence with foreign partners who reciprocated by providing surveillance data on Americans that the agency couldn't collect through domestic programs, creating a global financial surveillance network that operated outside normal legal restrictions. The conspiracy theories about comprehensive financial surveillance weren't paranoid fantasies about future dystopian possibilities. They were accurate descriptions of surveillance programs that were already operating through intelligence authorities that most Americans didn't know existed. The financial privacy that people assumed was protected by banking laws had been systematically undermined by intelligence agencies using foreign collection authorities and international partnerships. The same institutional patterns of secrecy, coordination, and public deception that enabled financial surveillance would soon be exposed in other sectors where powerful institutions had learned to hide their activities from public scrutiny while systematically betraying the research that made their operations possible. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment represents one of the most horrific examples of medical conspiracy theories that turned out to be completely accurate. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted a study on untreated syphilis in rural black men in Alabama, telling participants they were receiving free health care for bad blood. The conspiracy theorists who claimed the government was conducting illegal medical experiments on black Americans were dismissed as paranoid extremists who didn't understand how medical research actually worked. The study recruited 399 black men with syphilis and 201 without the disease as a control group. The men were never told they had syphilis, never gave informed consent for the research, and were deliberately denied treatment even after penicillin was discovered as an effective cure in the 1940s. Researchers wanted to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis, so they actively prevented participants from receiving medical care that could have saved their lives. The Public Health Service worked with local medical providers to ensure the men didn't receive treatment elsewhere. They provided incentives like free meals, transportation, and burial insurance to keep participants in the study while lying about the purpose of the research. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term that covered various ailments, when they were actually being studied as they suffered and died from a treatable disease. The conspiracy extended beyond the original researchers to include the Centers for Disease Control, which continued the study after taking over from the Public Health Service in the 1960s. Medical professionals, public health officials, and government administrators all knew about the deception, but allowed it to continue for 4 decades. The study only ended in 1972 when a whistleblower leaked information to the press, forcing public exposure of the experiment. By the time the study ended, 128 participants had died from syphilis or related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The men who survived suffered from blindness, deafness, mental illness, and other complications that could have been prevented with proper treatment. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government medical experiments on vulnerable populations had been absolutely right about the scope and brutality of what was happening. The researchers justified their actions by claiming they were advancing medical knowledge about syphilis progression, but the study produced no significant scientific insights that couldn't have been obtained through ethical research methods. The real purpose was studying how untreated syphilis affected black men, specifically based on racist assumptions about biological differences between races that had no scientific foundation. Medical professionals who participated in the study defended their actions by claiming they were following accepted research practices of the time, but ethical guidelines for human experimentation existed even in the 1930s. The Nuremberg Code, established after World War II, explicitly prohibited medical experiments without informed consent, yet the Tuskegee study continued for decades after these international standards were established. The conspiracy involved systematic deception at multiple levels of the medical establishment. Local doctors were paid to refer patients to the study without telling them about the research. Public health nurses were trained to maintain the deception while building trust with participants and their families. Hospital administrators allowed researchers to use their facilities while knowing that patients were being denied effective treatment. Government officials who knew about the study defended it as necessary medical research that served the greater good, showing how institutional authority was used to justify systematic human rights violations. The same arguments about national interest and scientific progress that justified intelligence operations like MKUltra were used to rationalize medical experiments that violated every ethical principle of healthcare. The cover-up involved destroying evidence and intimidating potential whistleblowers who might expose the experiment. Medical records were altered or destroyed to hide evidence of the deception. Researchers who expressed concerns about the ethics of the study were transferred to other positions or pressured to remain silent about what they had witnessed. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government medical experiments understood something that mainstream medical professionals missed. Institutional power combined with racial prejudice would produce systematic violations of human rights disguised as scientific research. They correctly predicted that government agencies would use vulnerable populations for unethical experiments while claiming to serve legitimate medical purposes. The Tuskegee experiment established patterns of medical deception that would be repeated in other government research programs. The same institutional incentives that allowed systematic medical abuse of Black Americans created the foundation for intelligence agency experiments like MKUltra, which used similar techniques of deception and cover-up to conduct illegal research on unwitting subjects. The regulatory reforms that followed exposure of the Tuskegee experiment were supposed to prevent future medical abuses, but they focused on oversight mechanisms rather than eliminating the underlying authorities that enabled unethical research. Medical institutions learned to operate within reformed ethical frameworks while still conducting research that violated the spirit of informed consent and patient protection. The conspiracy theorists weren't just right about the existence of unethical medical experiments, they correctly understood that government agencies would prioritize research objectives over human rights when secrecy allowed them to avoid accountability. The documented evidence proved that institutional medical authority would systematically deceive vulnerable populations while claiming to serve scientific progress and public health. The same patterns of institutional deception, systematic cover-up, and public denial that characterized the Tuskegee experiment would find new expression in the digital age, where powerful institutions discovered that technology platforms could manipulate public opinion just as effectively as medical authority had manipulated vulnerable patients. Social media election interference operations. The documented history of institutional manipulation shows us that foreign interference in American elections wasn't just a theoretical possibility that paranoid politicians worried about, it was systematic reality with documented evidence and criminal prosecutions. The Mueller investigation revealed extensive Russian operations designed to influence American voter behavior through social media platforms and targeted disinformation campaigns. Russian intelligence services conducted sophisticated influence operations during the 2016 election cycle using social media platforms to spread divisive political content and manipulate public opinion. The Internet Research Agency, a Russian troll farm, created thousands of fake American social media accounts that promoted polarizing political messages designed to increase social conflict and undermine trust in democratic institutions. These operations weren't random propaganda efforts, they were targeted psychological manipulation campaigns based on detailed analysis of American political divisions. The ADL Center on Extremism documented how foreign actors used generative artificial intelligence tools in 2024 to enhance their election interference capabilities. Russian and Chinese influence campaigns used AI to create synthetic speech robocalls and fabricated images designed to influence voter sentiment ahead of the U.S. presidential election. The technology allowed foreign intelligence services to create more convincing fake content that appeared to come from legitimate American sources. Deepfake videos became a significant tool for foreign influence operations, with Russian actors creating fabricated footage to spread divisive messaging related to U.S. politics and social issues. The AI-generated content was sophisticated enough to fool casual viewers, allowing foreign intelligence services to inject false narratives into American political discourse without detection. Chinese intelligence services also used similar techniques to promote content that would increase political polarization and social division. The conspiracy theorists who warned about foreign election interference understood something that mainstream political experts missed. Hostile foreign governments would use social media platforms to manipulate American voters rather than limiting themselves to traditional espionage activities. They correctly predicted that intelligence agencies would exploit the openness of American social media platforms to conduct influence operations that would have been impossible through conventional propaganda channels. Social media platforms initially denied that their systems were being used for foreign election interference, claiming that their content moderation systems were effective at detecting and removing inauthentic behavior. Platform executives testified before Congress that they had robust safeguards against foreign manipulation, while internal documents later revealed that they knew about extensive foreign influence operations, but were reluctant to take aggressive action that might reduce user engagement. The scale of foreign influence operations was far larger than most Americans realized, with Russian intelligence services reaching millions of American voters through coordinated social media campaigns. The Internet Research Agency spent over $1.25 million per month on Facebook advertising alone, while also operating accounts on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube that generated millions of interactions with American users. The operations targeted specific demographic groups and geographic regions based on detailed analysis of American political vulnerabilities. Foreign intelligence services didn't just create fake content, they also amplified existing American political divisions by promoting the most polarizing voices on both sides of controversial issues. Russian operatives would simultaneously promote far-left and far-right political content designed to increase animosity between different political factions. The goal wasn't to promote specific candidates or policies, but to undermine American social cohesion and democratic governance. The Mueller investigation resulted in criminal indictments against 26 Russian nationals and 3 Russian organizations for election interference activities. The indictments detailed how Russian intelligence services used identity theft, money laundering, and computer fraud to conduct influence operations targeting American voters. Federal prosecutors treated the foreign influence operations as criminal conspiracies rather than just political activities protected by free speech principles. Platform cooperation with foreign influence operations wasn't necessarily intentional, but their business models created incentives that made election interference profitable for foreign actors. Social media algorithms promoted content that generated strong emotional responses, which meant that divisive political content created by foreign intelligence services received algorithmic amplification that increased its reach and impact. The platforms were essentially subsidizing foreign election interference through their engagement optimization systems. The conspiracy theories about social media election interference contained elements of truth, but they often focused on the wrong actors and mechanisms. Instead of deliberate platform bias against specific political parties, the real problem was foreign intelligence services exploiting algorithmic systems designed to maximize user engagement. The platforms weren't necessarily trying to influence elections, but their systems were vulnerable to manipulation by actors who understood how to game engagement algorithms. Congressional investigations revealed that social media platforms had been aware of foreign influence operations for years before taking meaningful action to address them. Internal communications showed that platform executives were more concerned about the business impact of aggressive content moderation than about the democratic implications of foreign election interference. They prioritized user growth and engagement metrics over election security and democratic integrity. The regulatory response to foreign election interference has focused on requiring platforms to provide more transparency about political, advertising, and foreign influence operations. The Honest Ads Act would require social media platforms to maintain public databases of political advertisements, including information about who purchased the ads and how much they spent. However, enforcement remains challenging because foreign influence operations constantly evolve their techniques to avoid detection. The documented evidence of foreign election interference shows that conspiracy theories about systematic manipulation of American democratic processes weren't paranoid fantasies. They were accurate predictions about how hostile foreign governments would exploit American social media platforms and political divisions. The conspiracy theorists understood institutional vulnerabilities better than the experts who dismissed their concerns as impossible in democratic societies. But foreign election interference was just one example of how the conspiracy theories that seemed most impossible turned out to contain significant elements of documented truth. The patterns we've documented through NSA bulk surveillance programs and CIA operations like MKUltra show us something important about how conspiracy theories actually work. These weren't random paranoid fantasies that happened to be correct. They were accurate predictions based on understanding institutional incentives and historical patterns. Edward Snowden's revelations about Section 702 surveillance proved that conspiracy theorists who warned about mass government surveillance were absolutely right about the scope and systematic nature of these programs. The MKUltra experiments showed that warnings about government psychological manipulation weren't paranoid speculation. They were accurate assessments of what intelligence agencies would do when given secrecy authorities and unlimited budgets. What makes these cases particularly significant is that the conspiracy theorists understood institutional behavior better than the experts who dismissed their concerns. They correctly predicted that surveillance authorities would expand beyond their original purposes and that intelligence agencies would prioritize operational effectiveness over constitutional protections. The real lesson here isn't that all conspiracy theories are true, but that some institutional conspiracies are not only possible, they're predictable when you understand how power operates without accountability.